Right, well, with no further ado, we'll move ahead for the Food Thinkers today. Thank you so much for joining the October 2020 Food Thinkers. Our 2020 Food Thinkers series brings together big ideas from women in academia, policy, business, and advocacy on redesigning food systems. And today we're delighted to welcome Carina Millstone of the NGO Feedback, where she is Executive Director. Feedback's an environmental campaign group aiming to regenerate nature by transforming the food system. Welcome, Carina. My name is Carina Hawkes. I'm Professor and Director of the Centre for Food Policy, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. Welcome to you all. So let me introduce Carina to you. As I said, she's the Executive Director of the NGO Feedback. And she brings a lot of diversity of experience. She's started working in the business world as a sustainability consultant for environmental resources management, and has worked with several campaigning and movement building organizations, including the New Economy Coalition in the US. She's also been a visiting research fellow of Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University in Massachusetts, and she's a research fellow of the Schumacher Institute in Bristol. She's also a writer. Her book, Frugal Value, Designing Business for a Crowded Planet, has been published by Routledge and provides a blueprint for organizations in an ecologically viable system of production and consumption. And she's also a committed permaculturist. She founded the Orchard Project, which is a charity working with community groups in cities across the UK to plant and nurture community orchards in public urban spaces. So it's great to have you talk on this really big topic, big livestock versus the planet. And in her talk today, Carina is going to be presenting the climate, biodiversity, health and security case to end industrial meat and dairy production, especially in the context of COVID-19. She's going to present findings on the scale of global financing in the industry and highlight the need for structural and regulatory change to move towards diets aligned with the Paris Agreement on climate change. So we're really looking forward to hearing from her. Before I hand over to Carina, I wanted to say that this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available online afterwards via our YouTube channel. We do spread the word about these webinars, these Food Thinkers webinars, via our newsletter. We actually just sent our newsletter out about an hour ago, which we can sign up to, and we'll put the URL for signing up to that in the chat if you want to sign up to the newsletter and our mailing list. Actually, probably just easier if you want to type your name and email address into the chat function, and we can add it for you. Just send it to the panelists so not everybody sees it. We're also asking you to write any questions into the Q&A function, which I will moderate after Carina's talk. We always have lots and lots of amazingly fantastic questions from the audience on these Food Thinkers seminars, so do keep them coming in. We want you to listen and engage and ask questions. If you do have time, then do tweet out what you're hearing using the Food Thinkers hashtag, and we're at their Twitter handle at Food Policy City. This is a series of seminars that will be continuing into next year, and you can find more about the programme on our website. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Carina. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much. In 2012, environmentalist Bill Mckibben wrote an article for the Rolling Stone magazine called Global Warming's Terrifying New Mass. Research from Carbon Tracker had just shown that the fossil fuel companies, or big oil as they came to be known, had around 5 times as much fossil fuel reserves on their books as climate scientists knew would be safe to burn. And so, with this terrifying knowledge, and set against the backdrop of towering wildfires in Colorado and the hottest June on record, over some 6,000 words, Bill Mckibben compellingly built the case for the end of the fossil fuel industry. His call to arms inspired thousands of students, thousands of communities and faith groups around the world, who called on their university, their pension providers, their churches to divest from fossil fuels. 2 years after Bill Mckibben's clarion call, 180 institutional investors with $52 billion worth of assets under their management had committed to cut fossil fuel stock from their portfolio. Today, there are 1,100 investors representing $11 trillion worth of assets who have divested from fossil fuels, who have committed to do so, with the pace of commitment picking up significantly since the Paris targets of 2015. The UK Development Bank has recently pledged to stop fossil fuel financing. Just last week, the Rockefeller family wrote to the big banks in the States, telling them they must stop financing fossil fuels. Shell has listed divestment campaigning as a material threat in its annual report. And the students of Cambridge University, after many years of writing letters, of protesting in the streets, of occupying offices, have finally secured the pledge that they wanted from their university, that the university will divest from fossil fuel within the decade. 8 years later, now, as new temperatures are set every month and in the backdrop of a global pandemic, here is some more terrifying maths for you. There are currently, right now, 23 billion chickens, 1.5 billion heads of cattle, 1.2 billion sheep, 1 billion goats, and 1 billion pigs living on factories and farms worldwide. These numbers have been growing and growing rapidly. In the case of chicken, in just 2 decades, the farm chicken population has risen from some 14 billion to 23 billion. It's worth noting this is just a snapshot in time, as many of these chickens kept for broiler chicken, for meat, live short, miserable lives of just a few weeks. This year, we will be slaughtering 66 billion chickens. According to a 2018 paper in Royal Society Open Science, the factory broiler chicken, as we see on this image, is now a distinct marker of the Anthropocene, a distinct marker of the reconfigured human biosphere, leaving a geological imprint in the same way as the changed climate and the depleted natural world are doing. And we should be as terrified by these growing livestock numbers today as Bill Mckibben was in 2012 at the prospect of the fossil fuel industry burning its oil and the planet to oblivion. More animals mean more methane and more carbon dioxide. From the land converted to house them, from the forests cleared to feed them, from the food they eat, from the industry that sustains, processes, slaughters, and transports them. In other words, faster and greater climate and ecological destruction. The scale of these impacts should not be underestimated. 60% of animals have been wiped out in the wild since 1970. The main driver of this tragedy is land use change and deforestation for agriculture, much of it driven by animal feed crops. 70% of Amazonian deforestation has been attributed to cattle ranching, while the destruction of the Cerrado ecosystem has largely been driven by soy for animal feed. Food accounts for at least a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, the vast majority due to meat production. In fact, just earlier today, a report by the EU found that 80% of the EU's agricultural emissions are down to meat. Looking forward, according to Dr. Helen Harwood of Chatham House, the livestock sector is likely to account for close to half of the global emissions budget by the end of the decade to remain below 1.5-degree warming. This would force unfeasible levels of decarbonisation in other sectors should we wish to remain below safe levels of warming. As Sir David Attenborough has finally recognised belatedly in his final witness statement, A Life on This Planet, the planet simply cannot support billions of meat eaters. And while I'm focusing today on the livestock's climate and ecological impacts, it's also worth remembering that the livestock industry poses a huge risk to human lives and livelihoods, ranging from indigenous communities losing their land, to workers often working in hazardous conditions in meatpacking plants, and to more recently, meatpacking plants becoming hotspots for COVID-19 outbreaks around the world. In the States, rather than shutting down meatpacking plants in the early days of the pandemic, President Trump now famously ordered the meatpacking plants to stay open, following intense lobbying by meat corporation executives, who had publicly claimed that this was necessary to guarantee the US's food security. What we now know is that meat corporations actually increased their exports during the pandemic lockdowns, recording bumper shareholder dividends. Meanwhile, thousands of workers contracted the disease and hundreds of them died. Arguably, perhaps even worse still, the rearing of livestock in crowded environments is fostering the conditions for future viruses and future pandemics. And with 2/3 of antibiotics in the world used for animals, industrial meat and dairy production is raising the very real spectre of antimicrobial resistance. Last year, England's chief medical officer warned that antibiotics resistance could soon be killing at least 10 million people a year. And we will be left wondering why we let one industry so recklessly squander the gains of modern medicine. Now, before I go any further, it's really crucial to stress the distinction between livestock rearing as a farming practice and livestock rearing as an industry. Compassion in World Farming estimates that about 1/3 of the world's livestock is raised by farmers and pastoralists who rely on meat for good nutrition, food security, or to serve local markets. This is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is the remaining 2/3 of meat produced through industrial processes, what we might describe as intensive farming or factory farms or concentrated animal feed operations in the States. Meat production chiefly characterized by scale, with a large number of only one type of animal, requiring vast amounts of feed, embedded in national and global supply chains and markets, and usually requiring global finance. Big livestock. The industrial meat and dairy corporations is what I call big livestock. They're the ones driving climate and ecological impacts, not the smaller scale farmers. In fact, IATP and Grain, in their seminal report, Emissions Impossible, identified the 35 largest meat and dairy corporations in the world, which control the world market and account for the vast majority of the sector's impact. In fact, according to IATP, these 35 corporations, should they continue with their current growth ambitions, will account for 80% of the global carbon budget by 2050 to remain below 1.5 degrees of warming. So here they are, the 35 largest meat corporations in the world, big livestock. Have a look at them. Now, like any other global industry, the livestock industry has gone through a process of consolidation and expansion. And the largest 10 are now behind 15% of the cattle, 20% of the hogs, and 23% of the chickens slaughtered worldwide. Every day, these 10 corporations slaughter a mind-boggling 120,000 heads of cattle, 500,000 hogs, and 23 million chickens. Now, what's really striking to me in these 35 big corporations is that many of us have never heard of most of them and would really struggle to name them. The JBSs, the Tysons, the Cargills of this world. And actually, Cargill is the world's largest privately held company, and yet it's quite possible you've never heard of it. It's often known as the largest company you've never heard of. Worth noting, this is not accidental. It's not your ignorance here, but by design. Let's face it, this is not a pretty industry. So Cargill and its competitors prefer to conceal its realities with dozens of brands, many of them creating an illusion of choice and some bucolic reassurance. It's also worth noting that we might like to think this is an American problem, that these corporations do not represent the reality of British food and farming. And in fact, just last week, interestingly, the BBC upheld a complaint by the National Farmers Union that their documentary Meat, a Threat to Our Planet did not sufficiently highlight the differences between UK livestock farming and the large-scale feedlots of Brazil or of the US. While this is certainly true, and there are major differences in those systems, the picture is nonetheless a bit more complex and a bit more nuanced. UK supermarkets have been found to sell beef branded as their own, when in fact it is produced by JBS, the Brazilian giant linked time and time again to deforestation. Tesco's own brand, Willow Farms, conceals the fact that chicken is more likely to come from one of the UK's 800 or so so-called mega farms. Those are sprawling factories that can house up to 1 million chickens, 20,000 pigs or 2,000 dairy cows, rather than from a small family-owned outfit, as the name might suggest. The UK is also implicated in the global meat trade for its vast soya imports, relying on the land area overseas close to the size of Wales to feed its livestock, according to a new recent report by WWF. And of course, MP's recent dropping of food standards, what should have been a condition to any US trade deal, may well result in the UK market being flooded with American meat. Even when, following a series of recent mergers and acquisitions, many people are unaware that 30% of the UK's pork and half of the UK's chicken production is already controlled through complex joint ventures and subsidiaries by the likes of Cargill, JBS and Pilgrim. UK headquartered finance institutions are also instrumental in propping up these meat and dairy corporations, as we'll see. And so, what attitude should those of us deeply concerned about climate change, about the loss of the natural world, about species extinction, adopt towards these destructive corporations? So to answer this question, I think we first need to ask ourselves, to be fair to the industry, whether there's a version of it that would be acceptable to us. That is to say, that wouldn't be so destructive. That is to say, could the industry transform itself and resize itself to operate within equitable planetary boundaries? Could it reduce its ecological impacts to relatively benign levels? So to focus on emissions first as a proxy for broad ecological impacts, the opportunities for efficiency improvements, that is to say reducing emissions per stick, are actually very limited. According to the FAO, 44% of livestock's emissions come from enteric fermentation, 41% from feed, 10% from manure, and 5% only from energy consumption. So there's really two main options for improving emissions efficiency: improving feed conversion ratios, which are already optimized, or reducing enteric fermentation through synthetic chemicals or supplements such as seaweed in feed. Now, it's fair to say that some pilots have shown promising results here, but there is nonetheless no escaping the fact for these companies that their core business of rearing livestock consists of feed, digestion, and manure production, and it is therefore a business that is inherently emissions inducing. Also worth noting that any efficiency gains are likely to be cancelled out by the growth ambitions of these corporations. Now, it's easy to be reminded here of the industry I started this talk with, oil and gas. The likes of BP, seeking to make environmental claims, have to skirt around the inherently destructive nature of their product. They do so by marketing ultimate oil with active technology that may help keep your engine cleaner, that may improve its performance, and may therefore give you more miles per tank and reduce the emissions impact of your ride. But in reality, like for big livestock, these efficiency improvements are marginal and have no bearing whatsoever on our chances of averting catastrophic climate change. The industrial meat and dairy corporations can't readily reduce their emissions. So could they offset them instead? So it's worth saying that the vast majority of big livestock companies are taking no action whatsoever to reduce or offset their emissions. In fact, none of the 250 global exchanges require companies to report emissions associated with food and agriculture. So these corporations are not reducing their emissions, they are not monitoring them, they are not setting targets for reduction. So this is quite speculative as a question. So one or two meat and dairy corporations have made some commitments to net zero, the latest incarnation of offsetting. But their plans for net zero are very dubious and do not stand up to scrutiny. Arla's trick is simply to exclude methane from its plans, its main source of greenhouse gas emissions. Others planning to cash in on generous subsidy regimes to generate biogas from their manure, enabling another revenue stream. But the main approach to offsetting is afforestation. Afforestation, though, on a mass scale, raises all sorts of thorny ethical questions about land grabbing and rights, and chimes with the concerns recently raised by hundreds of human rights NGOs about the UN's plans to protect 30% of the planet, warning that this could lead to severe human rights violations. Not only that, this tree-based offsetting is unlikely to work, and in fact is more likely than not that it will fail in its goal of achieving carbon reductions. The recent wildfires in California, in fact, burnt down a forest that was meant to sequester carbon for 100 years, sending millions of carbon dioxide credits up into smoke and rendering them useless. Of course, other polluting industries have jumped on the net zero bandwagon too through afforestation, including most recently BP again, who have claimed that they will become net zero by 2050, in part through planting trees, although their scheme remains as yet unclear. With the 5 largest big livestock corporations emitting more greenhouse gases than BP, the scale of land for offsetting these polluting industries become apparent, and they will start competing with each other if they wish to carry on with business as usual, rather than address the emissions at the heart of their business model. What about the ultimate get out of jail free card? Could the meat and dairy industry stop producing meat and dairy? The proposition that meat and dairy corporations could transform themselves into the plant-based protein providers of the future is what many investors are banking on. A handful of meat and dairy corporations have made some forays into meat and dairy substitutes, including Tyson, Cargill, Marfrig and Arla. Broiler chicken executive Jim Perdue was pleased to placate some of his most vehement animal rights critic by reiterating recently that his vision is to be the most trusted name in protein, specifying it doesn't say premium meat protein, just premium protein. And yet there really is no evidence that this marks a transition for meat and dairy corporations away from their core business of rearing, slaughtering, and processing animals. While Tyson purchased a 5% stake in Beyond Meat in 2016, it sold it 3 years later. And Tyson's CEO has been keen to clarify that it's not an either or an or for him, and that he remains firmly committed to growing our traditional meat business alongside any alternative proteins. In fact, none of the big meat and dairy corporations, or none of the smaller ones, and none of them have any plans to reduce their meat offering. In fact, it also seems simply impossible that they could do this. It seems impossible that big livestock could instigate a wholesale transition to alternative protein production. There is no historical precedent for the wholesale transformation of an entire sector. Again, BP comes to mind. At the turn of the millennium, BP launched a $200 million public relations campaign, changing its logo and name to the now infamous Beyond Petroleum. Once viewed as the proof for shareholder engagement on environmental issues, BP's renewable program remains a fraction of its overall business, and the Beyond Petroleum rebrand was quietly dropped a few years later. This remarkable act of greenwashing arguably delayed any transition in the energy sector by some 20 years, and should really be a cautionary tale for those banking on meat and dairy corporations becoming plant-based. So, if we accept that the industrial meat and dairy industry cannot significantly reduce its emissions, cannot reliably offset, and cannot become a plant-based industry, the conclusion for me can only be that this is an industry that must be phased out and ended to avert the worst climate and species extinction scenarios. Big livestock is akin to big oil, if not worse, in its lack of compatibility with the living planet. And so at Feedback, along with many allies, we have launched a campaign over the summer, earlier this year, called Big Livestock versus the Planet. Whose side are you on? Inspired by and learning from fossil fuel campaigners, especially those calling for divestment and defunding of the industry. I would like to share 3 reflections on this campaign so far. The first, campaigning against meat and dairy corporations, highlighting the destruction caused by industrial production rather than consumption of meat, is really useful and critical in elevating the debate beyond the meat on your plate. It moves the discussion away from being a matter of health, of fashion, of personal preference, of fad, to really highlight structural issues, issues of corporate control and lobbying, an industry that really shapes our food options, that really shapes our policymakers' priorities, and enables us to show the industry for what it is. One that enriches a few in high-income countries, while frontline communities are affected by pollution in meatpacking plants or land clearances. To quote my colleague leading on this work, who put it so eloquently, Mia, we've moved beyond the conversations about switching off lights and cycling to work. So when it comes to an industry that's producing 7.14 gigatons of emissions each year, why do we continue to emphasize individual consumption? So by putting the emphasis on production, corporations, and finance instead, we avoid getting drawn into conversations around lifestyles or into culture wars, which miss the point. Rather, we open up the space for activists, for allies, working across a broad spectrum of issues to question the real issues at play, those of ownership, those of control, those of global justice and food sovereignty. The second reflection, if the ask is to end an industry rather than for it to change its way, we need to follow the money and go after the finances. There is no point trying to engage directly with meat and dairy corporations when we want them, when the ask is to end them, no less because the odds of being invited to the executive suite to make that case are pretty much nil. So by identifying and calling out financial ties between banks, pension funds, asset managers and institutions, especially institutions that claim a special stake in the future or special ecological responsibility, perhaps universities or faith groups, we can create discomfort, we can create embarrassment, we can create cognitive dissonance within financial institutions that can lead to divestment and debt denial. So could this mechanism used by fossil fuel campaigners apply to industrial meat and dairy? To find out, we first had to identify big livestock's finances, because in the same way as the names of industrial meat and dairy corporations weren't really in the public domain, neither did we know the identity of those funding them. So earlier this year, we commissioned some research conducted by Dutch NGO Profundo, and which we published in our Butchering the Planet report, highlighting the big name finances bankrolling livestock corporations and climate change. And what did we found? Well, we found that in the last 5 years, global meat and dairy companies received over $478 billion worth in backing from over 2,500 investment firms, banks, and pension funds headquartered around the globe. So drilling in a bit on the detail, we found that the 3 largest investors to big livestock by far are the usual suspects: BlackRock, Capital Group, Vanguard, US-based investment giants, and investors who, if you're already bankrolling climate change through the tar sands or coal expansion and Arctic drilling. Industrial meat and dairy is just a very small proportion of their portfolio, but through sheer size alone, they are the biggest backers by far. UK-based investors are far less implicated, and yet 2 of the UK's biggest pension funds, the Railway Pension Scheme, and what I think might be of interest to this audience, the university's superannuation scheme, invest in Hormel Foods, that you've probably never heard of, but this is the company behind Spam. Unlike for investors, many of big livestock's bankers are headquarters in Europe. The likes of BNP Paribas, Barclays, Santander, Deutsche, Rabobank, ING, all high street names that we're all familiar with. What's striking is that many of these banks have signed up to industry initiatives around deforestation, such as the Soft Commodities Compact, or have signed up to adopting science-based targets with regards to climate change and emissions reduction. And yet we have found that these banks have a complete blind spot when it comes to meat and dairy. Take Barclays. Barclays have pledged to become a net zero bank by 2050. But nonetheless remains the world's 2nd largest banker to big livestock. It likes to boast that it has been supporting UK farmers since 1744. But these are the same UK farmers whose business is being undercut by the likes of Cargill, Tyson, and others, to whom Barclays have provided millions of dollars in financing over the last 5 years. HSBC also aims to become a net zero bank by 2050, and its own agricultural commodities policy states that it will not provide financial services to customers involved in deforestation or land clearance by burning directly or through suppliers. And yet, over the last 5 years, HSBC has loaned Brazilian butchers Marfrig and Minerva over 1.8 billion, as well as holding millions in shares in JBS. Marfrig, Minerva, and JBS are the 3 big Brazilian cattle companies repeatedly linked time and time again to deforestation and land clearance in the Amazonian rainforest. So arguably, the findings of our research weren't exactly spectacular, to be honest. Headlines such as "banks lend money to companies" aren't exactly front page news. We would expect these banks to be lending to the big companies, big banks, big finance lending to big corporations. And yet we got remarkable coverage for this research, including in the FT, which we were very excited about, and which forced a response from some of the financial institutions we'd identified. Many of them had to reiterate their commitment to combating deforestation and climate change, and some even acknowledge, quote, an increased financial risk in the meat and dairy sector. So it's very early days with this campaign, but our success so far suggests to us that with the right scrutiny, the right public exposure of hypocrisy, when financial institutions fail to comply with their own targets and their own policies, that we can turn meat and dairy into both a financial and a moral liability. Since we started our campaign, there's already been some severing of ties between financial institutions and the most destructive meat and dairy corporations. Nordea Asset Management announced this summer that it would divest holdings of about 40 million euros in JBS, citing a failure of JBS to improve its environmental, social, and governance performance, despite extensive engagement from investors on these issues. This, for me, really demonstrates the limit of an investor engagement strategy when a company is inherently destructive in its core business. And a few weeks ago, Bloomberg attributed the drop in JBS's value to the barrage of negative publicity over its link to Amazonian deforestation and land clearances. In other words, according to Bloomberg, civil society pressure is working. The third and final reflection is that divestment and defunding campaign works in more ways than one. That is to say, loss of market capitalization or reduced finance availability shouldn't be the only markers of success for our campaign. In fact, perhaps changes in financial flows aren't the markers of success at all that we should be aiming for. In their article, Bill Mckibben's influence on US climate change discourse, shifting field level debates through radical flank effects, Todd Schifferling and Andrew Hoffman showed that Bill Mckibben and the fossil fuel divestment movement he inspired dramatically altered the climate change debate in the States through a radical flank effect. That is to say, the effects, both positive and negative, that radical activists have on more moderate activists working on the same cause, helping to indirectly promote the latter's asks. Through a network text analysis, they show that the divestment movement made hitherto marginal ideas such as carbon budget or carbon taxes or the notion of stranded assets more acceptable to a mainstream audience, even if they remain far-reaching in their implications. The message moved from student leaflets to financial papers, and the messages moved from students to investors, insurers, policymakers, fundamentally shifting the mainstream political and social discourse. Schifferling and Hoffman found that the indirect impacts of the divestment movement were far greater than divestment itself, the purported aim. Instead, it was critical in mainstreaming the notion that emissions need to be curbed and the energy system transformed, a position that is now no longer controversial. So there's been a radical flank with meat consumption for a very long time, with animal rights and vegans holding the hard line that the consumption of animals is never okay under any circumstance and needs to end. And with the raising in public consciousness of animal welfare and climate change, the vegan position has been critical in securing a more moderate mainstream position, with significant numbers of people reporting in recent years that they are consuming less meat or higher welfare meat or going vegetarian. So what we are seeking to do is to be meat's structural radical flank. And this is me doing just that outside of Barclays at the recent Extinction Rebellion protest last month, holding the hard line that meat and dairy corporations need to end and they need to be defunded. So if we're successful, not only will less finance be available for these companies, but the idea that we need to transition that we need a transition in the food system from industrial meat and dairy to plant-based and regenerative, on a par with the transition required in the energy system from fossil fuels to renewables, will be mainstreamed. What might that mean? It would mean, for example, that meat and dairy reduction targets would be integrated into national carbon budgets, as recommended recently by the Committee on Climate Change to the UK government. It would mean that meat and dairy reduction, so-called demand-side measures on consumption, would be integrated into the nationally determined contributions under the Paris process. And we are hoping that the UK government might go in that direction as they announce the UK's nationally determined contribution in December. It would mean that policymakers start putting in place soft and hard measures to reduce meat consumption, such as changes to guidelines or plant-based public procurement or taxation. On the production side, it would mean a change to the subsidy systems and plans for a just transition for workers who are currently working in the industrial meat and dairy sector. Retailers would reduce their meat offering as they expand their plant-based alternatives. So to conclude, in my view, the global production of meat and dairy is as incompatible with a safe climate and the renewal of the natural world as is the continued extraction of fossil fuels. So it's therefore right and it's therefore incumbent on food campaigners to learn from our fossil fuel campaigner allies and to work tirelessly to defund and delegitimize the meat and dairy industry. At the same time, the analogy I have made between big oil and big livestock does not hold completely true, and the two industries diverge in some really important ways. For example, companies in the meat and dairy sector are often privately held, whereas big oil is typically big oil corporations are typically state-owned or publicly traded. There are many small-scale farmers supplying the meat industry in a way that we do not have small artisanal oil rigs supplying the industry, as it is so capital intensive to have an oil rig. However, crucially, big oil and big livestock diverge in ways that should give us confidence that we can end the meat and dairy industry and that we can do it at pace. Why is that? Unlike fossil fuel, big livestock is a small, discrete sector of the economy. It's often a very small part of an investment portfolio. Investor could easily and readily screen their investment portfolio for this kind of animal agriculture and remove it. There are already funds doing just that. As a small sector of the economy, it's composed of a few dozen corporations only, and these corporations are not in any way foundational. If big oil were to shut overnight, this would have dangerous ramifications across our economy and society, while the impacts of shutting down big livestock would be limited to the industry and its suppliers, although I do not want to minimize the effects on workers. And as far as customers are concerned, while it's really hard at the moment to live one's life without any fossil fuel, we get excluded from big parts of modern life, Alternatives to industrial meat and dairy already exist. We already know how to grow plant-based protein and turn it into delicious dishes. So unlike the energy transition to renewable, the shift to a food system in line with the Paris targets, where diets are largely plant-based, does not require the acquisition of new knowledge, the building of new infrastructure, or the deployment of new technologies. We do not need to wait for the impossible burgers, the clean meat, the cell ag, the precision fermentation. Protein is simply not a problem in need of a techno fix. The solutions are here, and plant-based proteins are already widely available. And so, we at Feedback will continue our calls to end industrial meat and dairy, and by calling out its financiers. We have made our full financial data set available to all on our website so that journalists, allied organizations, or anyone else can make a link between their banks or their pension providers or their institutions and meat and dairy corporations. We are working on building the capacity of young people and students to take action, supporting them in calling their universities to divest from meat and dairy, especially when institutions have divested from fossil fuel, or especially when institutions have committed to reducing meat on campus in canteens, while investment portfolios continue to support continued meat production. So this is really an invitation for you all to join us. So I think that together we can really cut meat and dairy's financial and moral fodder to stabilize our climate and enable the renewal of the living planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carina. That was a tour de force. Thank you so much. And there's been lots and lots of questions coming in, so you might want to grab a glass of water and take a breath. But a lot of real interest in your talk. Thank you very much. That was very powerful indeed. There's a first lot of questions which I've gathered together that I'd like to ask first, which you touched on, but I think from the questions that have come in, I think people would like to have clarification. And there's 4 related questions. I'll read them out all to make sure I'm not missing out any angle. But B.R. Longman says, do you think there's a place for livestock in sustainable food systems? Innocent said, is it all about all of us becoming complete vegetarians? Tanya says, are you suggesting that smallholder and dairy farmers should be abolished? And Catherine says, how does the less but better meat fit into this? So could you clarify for the questioners, like what your position is in smaller meat production facilities, the so-called better meat production, and whether it's all about getting rid of all meat production and everyone becoming a vegetarian? Can you help the questioners with that? Thank you.
Yeah, yes, this is a really critical point. You know, where does one stand? Is there meat or is there not meat in the food system we wish to create? So we are at Feedback not a vegan organization. We are of the less and better ilk that a lot of people have signed up to, such as the Eating Better Coalition. And I think for us, we've wondered, what exactly does better mean? It seems to me that while we can all agree on less and better meat, that we're still struggling to have a common understanding of what we mean by better. Of course, animal welfare organizations would say that this means better conditions. But from our perspective, better is around a question of feed. So bearing in mind, the bulk of the impact comes from feed and enteric fermentation. The better for us is better feed. And what would this better feed be? So better feed is feed where animals can contribute to effective nutrient cycling on the level of a farm or maybe on a level of a region. So at the moment, what's so destructive, in my view, about this kind of corporate industrial system is importing feed for animals from overseas. So the animal husbandry is not at all embedded in local environments. So as I mentioned in the talk, even the high welfare animals in the UK are fed on soy, right? So are embedded in this global soy supply chain, some of it from the States, but some of it from Paraguay and from industrially sensitive and from ecologically sensitive regions of the world. So we've landed, the position we've landed on at Feedback, which is based on research from Wageningen University, Hannah Van Santen's group, is that it's actually better not from an environmental perspective and a land perspective. The optimal diet is not a vegan one. The optimal diet is largely vegan, but there is a role for meat where meat can act as a nutrient cycler. And by this, I would mean where the likes of pigs and non-ruminant omnivore can eat unavoidable human inedible food waste and contribute to nutrient cycling that way. So in our view, there is a small role for meat in those systems when it is fed on human unavoidable food waste. Bearing in mind, this is not currently legal. So that is one of our campaigns at Feedback to revert the ban on feeding treated food waste to non-ruminant omnivores. So I hope that answers the question. So less and better, so much less, no industrial production systems, and meat limited to meat integrated into a circular regenerative system.
Great, thanks very much for that. There's a further question from Tim, which I think you may have answered, but just to be sure, he asked, where is the dividing line between industrial ruminant production and the small farms which depend on ruminants for protein in harsh environments?
So just to make sure I completely understand the dividing line between this reliance on ruminants versus the industrial farming.
The reliance between industrial ruminant production,
yeah,
and ruminants produced on small farms, and those small farms depend on ruminants for protein when they are in harsh and difficult environments where other protein sources are difficult to get.
Yeah, so I hope I was seeking to make that distinction during my talk. Perhaps it wasn't clear enough that I think we really need to make a big distinction between animals that are kept for good nutrition, for subsistence farming, indeed in harsh environments, or food security, obviously. So these kind of smaller scale farms, or to serve local markets, compared to animals that are kept ultimately to generate profit for shareholders. And I think that's the big distinction that we need to make. So I'm really going after here keeping animals for shareholder profit rather than keeping animals because it makes sense on your farm, on a smaller scale system. You're serving your family and your local community. So that is the critical distinction. Obviously, it's a bit fuzzy. Where's the line drawn? So that's why we really are going for these kind of very large outfits that all of us, wherever we stand in the kind of less and better debate, can all agree they're the worst, right? We struggle to define exactly the role of meat and the exact parameters in less and better, but we all know that we do not want the concentrated animal feed operation, the big American style feedlots. So where we draw that line is difficult. I would say that the scale is one of the parameters. The extent to which the company's kind of embedded in global finance is another one, and ultimately whether it exists for profit or for shareholder profit, or for profit for the farmer and on a subsistence level.
That's clear. Thank you very much, Carina. Kezia asks several questions. I'll start with one. What is your view about these industrial for-profit companies producing meat developing plant-based products in the same way that companies like BP have developed lines in renewables? The idea that these big livestock companies start to develop lines in plant-based products instead. What's your view on that?
Again, I think it's something I touched upon. The answer is I'm highly skeptical, highly skeptical. If you look at there's an investor hype around this, but if you look at the research of the likes of FAIR, the Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return, so an investor engagement initiative, the overwhelming majority of companies are not experimenting with plant-based alternatives. The handful that are, and we can name them, there's Tyson, there's Arla, there's just a handful, is promising, but nonetheless, none of them are intending to reduce their meat offering, right? They see it as an additional line to their business. So it's a good thing, more plant-based, why not? But for me, the indication that this would be a true transformation would be a parallel commitment of increasing plant-based alternatives and decreasing meat products. There is no evidence of that happening. As I mentioned, there is no evidence that a sector can transform in that way. So I hold the line that I'm incredibly skeptical of any meat CEO saying, yes, why not, we'll be plant-based looking forward. I would even argue that I feel that some of the animal rights activists have been taken in by this argument, and therefore engage with these companies on that basis. I think that's probably a mistake. Having said all this, I might well be wrong, and I'm open to being wrong, and I'd be delighted if I'm proven wrong, but I don't think I will be. I think there's perhaps a last point to raise is that a lot of our allied animal rights campaigners, they would see it as a victory if the end point, if it ends up that JBS becomes a plant-based company, this would be a victory. In our minds, it wouldn't. Ultimately, it would be a great start. We do not want industrial meat and dairy in the system, but neither do we want a food system that is controlled by corporations, where products are patented. A lot of the kind of more edgy plant-based alternatives have patented ingredients in them. That's not the food system we're after either. So I do not think this transition will happen. If it does, I do not think it solves issues of ownership and control and food sovereignty in the food system.
So thanks for that. I guess you might agree with the point that Carol is making in that case. And she says, aren't we in danger of replacing big corporation meat production with big corporation meat-free production? And she points out that Oatly, I guess that's the alternative milk brand, has taken a 10% investment from Blackstone, who are linked to fires in the Amazon. So her concern is that the corporates will stay, they'll just be producing meat-free alternatives. I guess that reflects your own view, Carina.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, ultimately, I think one needs to kind of decide where we fall on the big dividing line of, if we end up with a food system that is the food system that we know we all want, one where everyone has access to fair, secure nutrition around the world, and one that operates within planetary boundaries, that enables the renewal of ecosystems. So if we get this food system that we all agree that we want, will this be a food system in which there are corporations? I think this is a really, really important question to answer strategically, because if the answer is yes, then absolutely we should be working within the corporate system to bring this about. If the answer is no, strategically this is quite different, and we need to start building an alternative system. So, in terms of plant-based proteins and the likes of Oatly and and milk substitutes, I have not yet seen evidence or research of how of whether it would be possible to have a transition to that system that's equitable, or what would the community-owned version of those kind of products look like? Could they be open source, for example? At the moment, we are indeed at risk of replicating the current corporate control of meat production with alternatives. So I absolutely agree with that point.
And I think Miral is also bringing that up. She says the emphasis of what you said is on plant-based eating, but she says plant-based does not necessarily mean sustainable. necessarily, and therefore she's arguing that the focus should be on more local corporations and a different type of food system. I think that's also the point that you've been making.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You're right. Plant-based. We don't want to be replacing our current food with Monsanto control soya fields from Paraguay. Absolutely. So it has to be plant-based and kind of regenerative as well. Absolutely.
And there's a couple more questions from people about, but I think you've answered them now. One is saying, are you recommending everyone go vegan or not? And the other one is, are you saying it's the end of all meat or just certain types of meat? I think you've now answered that. But for Michael and Bien, who answered those questions, if there's a follow-up question, then please do put that into the chat. There's also a challenge here from Gavin, who's saying, is it really realistic in our current capitalist system to seek for the end of an entire industry, the big livestock industry you've been talking about? Would regulation not be a more pragmatic ask?
Yeah, so I think, is it realistic? Is that this is interesting, right? It's a strategy question. Regulation to what end? I would throw back, what would be the regulatory ask if Gavin buys my argument that this is not an industry that can be transformed to be ecologically benign. So core to my argument is that we know we cannot have fossil fuels if we want to a safe climate. My argument is that same kind of thinking needs to apply for meat and dairy corporations as well, that their product is inherently destructive. So regulation to what end would be a question, to Gavin. Obviously they could improve their performance at the margins. There could be some requirements on feed, but the kind of current growth model, the way these kind of corporations are structured, we know that any improvements in their performance will be negated by their growth as things currently stand. Having said that, as I said, we based this campaign on an academic paper that I touched upon, that analysed, what did a fossil fuel divestment movement achieve, and we would say that this kind of hard line campaigning that sure is perhaps not realistic, but in my view expresses the reality that we cannot have a food system, a sustainable food system that includes these corporations, that this kind of hardline campaigning helps to create the climate for other groups to push for regulation. So other groups and even ourselves, other campaigns, we also, some of my other colleagues are also, pushing UK policymakers to adopt sort of softer measures as well. And of course, there are groups, other groups, not ourselves necessarily, but looking at the subsidy system to replace CAP, or indeed trying to reform the subsidy system in the EU. So those kind of regulatory interventions are absolutely part of the picture. I think the question is for me, what compels policymakers to adopt policies? And certainly in my experience of campaigning, well, certainly, there's a big preference in the UK and in the EU to a lesser extent to not adopt any policies, to be non-interventionist for a government. And so the question becomes, what does it take to compel governments to intervene? And I think that that's partly creating this kind of public climate, the negative publicity, creating a climate where investors and businesses are leading the way, and creating the evidence base to justify policy interventions. So strategically, this is where we've ended up. That does not mean, of course, that you're not absolutely right, that we would need some kind of regulatory interventions as well.
Great, thank you. Well, you mentioned about quite the hard messaging. There's a really interesting question from Alex here, and she or he says the message that you're presenting is pretty confrontational. While Alex, I think, agrees with what the basis is of that message, the question is, Have you done any research into the messaging, the way that you are messaging this, the way that you are framing the messaging in this very confrontational way? Have you done research that indicates that the confrontational nature of your message will be effective with your intended audience?
The answer is no. And again, the only, what we've got to draw on is what confrontational positions that were deemed extreme with regards to fossil fuels 10, 20 years ago. The idea that we will need to move to a world where there are no fossil fuels required confrontational positioning. And those views are now mainstreamed. So we are trying to replicate that same dynamic. So the answer is we don't have we do not have the evidence that's for this particular issue that confrontational stance is likely to be effective or less effective.
Okay, thank you. So there's a bunch of questions here about the investment divestment piece, and one from Margot, and she's asking, can funds be divested from these huge companies and redirected to support the smaller producers who are producing meat in a regenerative manner?
Could they be? Possibly. So in terms of our messaging, one thing that we did explore is whether we wanted to be more of a divest invest kind of message, just as suggested. That would have a positive spin as well, right? So you're right, divest from the big players, invest in regenerative opportunities. It's not necessarily clear to me these opportunities are there yet for that these big institutional investors to switch from one to the other. There are, however, some funds, and some indices that have excluded animal agriculture. So it can be done, whether it's being rechanneled to regenerative mechanisms or just to other industries, I don't know, but I think more likely the latter. So, for example, only 7% of UK charitable foundations and trusts, a report that came out today, about 7% of them exclude animal agriculture from their portfolio. So they can do it, presumably others could as well. Again, the kind of divest invest message came out of the fossil fuel divestment movement for a more positive spin, and certainly, talking to fossil fuel campaigners now, especially at universities, that's where they're at with their messaging and with their asks. In fact, thinking about divest, but also how could you contribute more usefully to your local community and constituency. We are not yet there with that messaging. We feel there is still a need for this harder line that challenging the social legitimacy of these corporations at all. So we are still holding that that harder line.
And Elizabeth asks, are groups like Moody's acknowledging the risks of continuing investments in meat and dairy at all?
Who's sorry, I missed the question.
The group like Moody's, the company that rates in investments and assesses the risks of investments. Is there any acknowledgement in the investment community that it's risky to invest in meat and dairy?
Right. That's a good question. Well, that's the thing, right? The answer is no, not yet. And that's exactly the climate we want to create, where investors, even responsible investors, you have screened, who are thinking about fossil fuels, who are going net zero, there's all sorts of declarations and industry initiatives, but yet the blind spot on meat is there. So that's our first level is the first entry point is highlighting that meat is something investors ought to be thinking about, investors and banks ought to be thinking about, and rating agencies as well. At the moment, there is none of that. I mean, it's quite shocking, in fact. I was surprised to find this out, but at the moment, there is none of this. So, how does one do that? Well, you create, as a civil society group that we create that climate where all of a sudden it becomes necessary for investors and bankers to think about meat and include it in their climate strategies or in their deforestation strategies. At the moment, that's simply not happening. So this is for us why it was such a victory having the FT cover our work, because random group X of environmental activists are calling for the end of meat and think meat is risky. So what? The FT interviewing various fund managers and getting their view creates the climate where this is an issue that's discussed and a salient issue for the industry. So we're really at the entry level, I would say, with these issues.
Bobby would like to challenge your argument. It says that you may be overstating the impact of divestment. Shares dumped by allegedly ethical investors will be grabbed up by others seeking a bargain for premium shares. In other words, if people divest, then the shares that they divest of will be grabbed by others seeking a bargain, and suggesting that naming and shaming doesn't work in the long run, given, for example, there's been a divestment campaign against companies like Shell and Nestle for decades, and yet they remain powerful and profitable.
Yeah.
So what is your reaction to that?
Yeah. Well, this is where perhaps one of the last points I tried to make in the talk, but to expand a bit, that a lot of people have said the divestment movement was a failure, right? Even Bill Gates is saying divestment doesn't work. Exactly this argument that, there'd always be another buyer there. So maybe two things to say. The first is that a lot of the meat corporations are not publicly traded, and actually a more effective entry point is debt denial. And that's a strategy we're exploring as well. So could we get banks to refuse to lend to the industry? And that might be more effective than divestment. But then the second point that I was perhaps making is that really we need to think about financial campaigning in its broader sense as an opportunity to talk about a structure, and as really an opportunity to delegitimize the industry, and that as a target, as a process goes a lot further than what happens to financial flows. So again, that this paper on which we've based our campaign does suggest that, sure, if you look at the divestment movement in terms of numbers of schools divested, that could be a success metric, pretty good. But actually, number of fossil fuel projects that have failed to secure financing because of the divestment movement, all of a sudden it doesn't look quite so successful. So that's why you need to understand it more broadly as to what reflecting on to what the extent to which having this kind of hard line calling for divestment, delegitimizing, defunding can help speed along the more moderate positions. And here there's evidence that happened in the fossil fuel divestment movement. Whether it can happen in this sector remains to be seen, but that's certainly what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. There's so many questions coming in. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I wanted to ask a question from one of our American colleagues, Michael. You mentioned about American feedlot earlier, and he makes the point that in the United States, most beef cows start on a farm or ranch, and then they move to a feedlot. So they start on a normal, whatever that means, normal farm before they're moving on to a feedlot. So what's the implication for these farms and ranches? I mean, you mentioned before about protecting jobs and the challenges around that. Like how have you thought that through in your analysis? And he also says that there's data indicating that well managed, including intensively managed pastures for ruminants, can actually be a net carbon sequester. And again, how have you thought through that data, and how does that fit into your strategy?
Yeah, so on the first point, I think this is where one draws the line, and perhaps this is what I was touching upon in the limits of the analogy. It's quite clear what is an oil rig and what isn't. Whereas in the livestock sector, the smaller scale farmers who are bringing their animals to slaughterhouse versus starting off the animals in pasture before going to feedlots, that distinction is not as clear. I recognize that, and it's a hard one to make. I think I think though, like if we are thinking that we cannot support this kind of industrial and animal agriculture, there will need to be some transition to alternative ways of producing food. Who is best placed to lead that transition? Well, probably governments, if should they want to. This kind of this notion of just transition that's been, the notion of just transition in the fossil fuel sector for kind of jobs that are being lost in coal, I think needs to be applied in the food system as well. That's not something that ought to come from NGOs like ourselves. This should be a process from governments. If governments are to integrate that transition, that food system transition in their climate strategies. The question about whether well-managed pasture can contribute to carbon sequestration, this is very controversial. It might well be the case, but obviously, Tara Garnett's work, she has suggested that's not the case. And for me, this is a conversation, I will be honest, that I try to avoid, because this is not the problem we're pointing at, really. What we're pointing at are these kind of industrial systems. Yes, livestock within a regenerative, circular, environment appropriate system might well be the right food to be producing. I entirely recognize that, but this is not what I'm going after, with this campaign.
And you mentioned livelihoods there, and Thomas makes the point that livelihoods matter, they're important. And if we are going to see this transition that you talk about, it will require financing of some type in order to support livelihoods engaged in a different type of farming. Who do you see as being actually responsible for that financing?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see a world in which the scale of the transition can be carried out by anyone else other than governments. So I'm not very optimistic because of this kind of preference for governments to be non-interventionist and to rely on private finance. Having said that, we've seen, with the pandemic, one of the upsides of the pandemic, if there is one, is that it turns out that in a moment of crisis, the governments, the British government, I don't want to speak for everyone else, the British government found money on the magic money tree. There was a magic money tree after all, and was willing to intervene to address a moment of national crisis. In my view, we are entering the moment of national crisis with regards to climate change. Certainly, fossil fuels is a key part of this, so is the consumption-based economy, but also our farming system is a key part of this as well. Again, research coming out today showing that the UK is one of the most nature deficient countries in Europe. The government, has said it intends to regenerate nature and so on. So, and that of course goes hand in hand with what's being farmed and how it's being farmed in the UK. So where would that transition and that impetus come from? In my view, it can only come from governments who are the only actors really with the legitimacy to do it, and the financial resources. Whether it will happen in a planned way remains to be seen. But the experience of the pandemic suggests to me that it can be done. There is a reservoir of kind of intervention there, when a crisis does hit.
Thank you. And there's a couple of points I'd like to make from people who work with animals. So Kevin says that he doesn't identify with your some of the descriptions that you've said that are industrial agriculture. He's from the Yorkshire Dales, and he sees it in a bit of a different way. He's making that point from his perspective. And another point that is being made by a vet, Nayantara, Nayantara says that they struggle, that they agree that the divestment away from an industrial system to regenerative farming is a good idea, but that it is absolutely sort of embedded from a vet's perspective in terms of the education that they receive and about how veterinary science currently functions and vets currently functions, and the entire way that the system is set up. And so what is defined as good from a vet's perspective as a vet, and it same applies for many agriculturalists, is often one that is following a more a medical model, a chemicals driven model, even though it's more unsustainable. So in other words, it's really embedded in the whole history, training, skills, not just of big agriculture companies, but across the whole system, which suggests there's a large task here.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure that's a question. I mean, I think yes, absolutely. On the vet point, obviously, I think this is a point that applies across agricultural systems. I mean, a lot of in terms of agriculture is practiced in a particular way, and that we, in terms of relying on fossil fuel inputs, in terms of petrofertilizers, in terms of monocultures and crop rotation and all this. So we are. The agricultural system has moved towards one that we now know is unsustainable. So I suspect, that also applies, by the sounds of it, to veterinary sciences. In terms of Kevin's point, I think, as I tried to stress in this presentation, all this is on a spectrum, and the worst successes of it are not in the UK. Even if there are these mega farms, is a relatively recent phenomenon in the UK, and nonetheless the trend towards bigger outlets, especially for pigs and chickens, is a very real one, with a lot of these really sprawling factories, a million chickens, up to a million chickens, now becoming relatively common. But I do recognize that is not necessarily not what I was describing was the worst case scenario, which is not necessarily the experience of UK farming as a whole. I did try and make the point, though, that the UK's involvement in this system comes from other ways, including the animal feed imports and including the finance.
Thank you. As I said, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to get to all of the questions here. But if I could ask one from a couple of related questions. Muriel makes the point that there's a lot of greenwashing going on, and it can be quite challenging for consumers to kind of navigate this. But Paulina asked the question, given the situation, what is your advice for what citizens should do around this issue? What can we do?
I think as citizens, I think there are very real limits to individual behavior change. That shouldn't mean that we shouldn't, try and live our life as far as possible within our budgetary and time constraints, as we think, to support the system we want to create. So the way I see it, for myself, is that I would rather not engage with supermarkets at all, but within my budget and so on, I largely shop at supermarkets, but then I support my local box scheme. So I think there's a baby steps within one's own life of trying to help the new economic system, the new food economy that we seek to create. But I think what's really important is that in our capitalist society, what's happened is that food has been treated as a commodity. What's happened is that food is being treated in policy spheres as a matter of choice and personal preference and consumer preference, and we're really stuck in this kind of consumer preference model. However, given the kind of societal and environmental impacts of food, I think it's really critical that food is treated as a civic issue, and for this to be a civic issue, what this means is that it's something that goes beyond what you would purchase at a supermarket, but something you engage your community with, and ultimately something that you engage your representatives with. So what can we do? Well, very practically, the UK is hosting, there's a big food system summit next year. The UK is hosting the COP. At the moment, the UK is developing its nationally determined contribution. So how would it contribute to reducing emissions? It's developing its carbon budgets. I'm pretty sure that most MPs are not getting emails from their constituents saying, I care about food, I care about climate, I care about nature. Will you be an advocate in parliaments, in governments, to adopt, for the government to adopt strong measures to enable a transition towards a better food system? So I think it's really critical that as individuals, we kind of politicize this issue and take it, beyond our consumer power, which of course we should all exercise, to our communities and to our politicians as well.
And a couple of questions here on different forms of meat, if you like, animal source foods. Kelly says, do you have, and we haven't got much time left, so very quickly, do you have a stance on the seafood and fish industry? And Heike asks, how about eating within healthy limits the less commonly consumed parts of animals, such as livers, kidneys, blood and offal, so that we're maximizing the livestock that is being produced?
Yeah, well, these are two really important points. If we're going to eat meat, we need to eat the whole body. Absolutely. It's worth saying that at the moment, although there's some that's wasted, a lot of it is exported to markets that do eat parts of meat, offal and parts that are not typically consumed in British culture, for example, and the remainder is sent to pet food, in fact. So it's kind of part of this system, and pet food is deeply embedded, unfortunately. I speak as a dog owner, is unfortunately deeply embedded in this kind of big livestock industry. But yes, absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. A critical component of reducing meat is eating the whole animal and not wasting food. I mean, this is another big part of it, making sure that you do eat all the meat that you have purchased. Oh, vegan dog food. Thanks for the tip, whoever put that. Yeah. In terms of seafood, I think this is really, I'm so glad someone mentioned this, because obviously a lot of us are aware about the collapse of fisheries, yet there are still omega-3s and other elements that are good from seafood. So people, eating seafood is a position, at Feedback, this is part of our vision of a sustainable food system. However, what's happened certainly is the shift towards aquaculture that was portrayed as an answer to the problem of fisheries depletion, when in fact aquaculture has come with all sorts of problems. Obviously, there's animal welfare issues in terms of keeping farm salmon in particular in nets, in a way that's really completely different to their natural life cycle. But also, these are carnivorous fish, and so they need to be fed with wild fish. So here you end up with an incredibly inefficient system whereby farmed fish is being fed fish that is already human edible, rather than feeding that fish directly. And in fact, in the case of farm salmon in Scotland, Scottish farm salmon eat as much fish as the whole of the UK population. So that's clearly a massive inefficiency, but there is still a role for seafood in good diets and in diets that are land efficient, especially with regards to unfed aquaculture, so the likes of mussels, for example.
Thank you. Well, we are at time now, but I'll just run through a few more questions. I do apologize for those I haven't got to. There are so many questions here, and Kezia, you had so many questions, and I'm trying to just ask one from each person. So I'm so sorry, Kezia, that I haven't had a chance to answer more of your questions. But of course, do get in touch with Carina directly, and there's some others as well who've asked lots of questions when I haven't managed to get to. But let me just end with a selection just for you to touch on very briefly. Hazel asks, has there been any work that actually models a transition away from industrial meat and dairy and visions what that might be, or models what that might be for smallholder suppliers? And have you thought about extending your campaign to all of industrial agriculture, with big livestock just being kind of one element of that? Barbara suggests that regenerative, animal welfare friendly, environmentally appropriate agriculture is great, but she worries that it means that the price of food is going to go up significantly, and so she's concerned and would like a response to that. And Ray says, is there a danger of replacing industrial livestock farming with industrial arable farming? Again, it's along the same point about replacing industrial with industrial, and how do you manage that? So I'm sorry to everybody else, but if you could just touch very briefly on those, Carina.
Yes, so I don't know all the answers in terms of kind of modeling away from the transition. I think we are campaigners, we're not academics, but in terms of the literature that we've used, that we found really useful, it includes, as I mentioned, Wageningen University, Hannah Van Santen's work, where she is modeling kind of the land requirements and nutrition generated from different types of models. So that's worth checking out. And also a French group called IDRI. I'm not entirely sure what IDRI stands for, but they are a French think tank who've done great work modeling the kind of agroecological, the emission saving potential and rewilding potential of agroecological models. The work that I have not yet seen is necessarily how you get from A to B, but there are people working on what the end point might look like. In terms of food prices, obviously affordability is obviously a big part of this. We want to move to a food system where everyone has secure access to nutritious food. What's the answer there? It's a bit tricky. I mean, I would argue that food, of course, at the moment is too cheap, in as much as, there is no reflection of its environmental impacts. The Sustainable Food Trust once estimated that, for every pound spent in the supermarket, there's an extra pound cost that's borne by the NHS in terms of poor diets, or by communities in terms of degraded environments. So that would make the argument that food is too cheap. Obviously, the flip side of that would be suggesting we need it to be more expensive, and then affordability is an issue. So I mean, I would argue here that we will need to move to a system that is more equal, and this touches to a wider point of what levels of inequality are permissible within society. And at the moment, of course, we have both a system that's created climate change and that's destroyed nature, while leading to the most unequal society in terms of wealth distribution that's ever been experienced. So I think this points to broader structural economic issues. Are we in danger of replicating one industrial system for another? Yes, but I hope not. That's certainly not what we're hoping to do here. And I think it's a two-pronged process. I think with this campaign, we are calling out the industrial, what we don't like about the industrial process. But at the same time, there are loads and loads of groups out there who are working on the solution, getting on with the solution, be it the Lands Workers Alliance and other small businesses experimenting with different farming practices, or agroforestry, and so on. So I think it's a two-pronged process that we both need to be campaigning against what we don't like, and this is the role we're occupying in this campaign, while also building the world that we want to see. And I think that's happening. There are many examples of that happening.
Thank you. And we've still got quite a lot of participants online. So if you'll bear with me for just a final question from Anthony. I think he's assuming that you've experienced hostile reactions from the meat industry, and was just curious about the form, if you have, and what form they might have taken. And that's the last question, I promise.
No, well, the good news is that we haven't, in as much as we've made the strategic decision not to engage with them, in a way, because we've decided they're not really worth our time. And, for them, we are just another, fringe group. This is an industry that obviously is highly controversial and has been the target of campaigners for many years on an animal rights basis. We are not an animal rights organization, so the basis of our campaign is new. We are now targeting them as environmentalists, as kind of climate advocates, and as I guess natural restoration advocates, but they have not we are not yet important enough for them to respond to us. I think that might change, as we're getting more and more mainstream press coverage. Our findings were kind of Bloomberg and others, and then we'll see at that stage. But the main target of our campaigning is financial institutions.
Yeah, got you. Okay, well, I'm sorry again. The incredible richness of the questions. I'd like to thank very much our audience for asking such questions and engaging so strongly. And I really, this is a fantastic talk. I'd like to just respond to one of the comments that was made, that what we do at Food Thinkers at the Centre for Food Policy is to provide a platform for all kinds of ideas that have been well thought through and are the result of thinking and interrogation and analysis, whether that comes from campaigners, researchers, governments, businesses, whoever. We're not trying to purport any particular view. We're giving a voice and giving a platform to those with views in order to open up a space for discussions. And Carina, you've certainly done that for us today. So thanks very much for the incredibly powerful presentation and answering those questions with a lot of clarity and patience. There was a lot there. So thank you very much indeed. And to everybody listening, just a reminder that the webinar will be made available online afterwards. So do spread that to your colleagues when it's available. And thank you very much indeed, Carina, and everyone else. We'll end there. Good evening, everyone. Good day. Thank you.